My friends, when we look at the history of World War II in the Pacific, it's easy to focus on the major battles, Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima. But today, I want to take you to a moment of despair and, at the same time, of almost insane audacity. I want to take you to the beginning of 1942, a period that, for the United States, was the lowest point of the war. It was the winter of our morale, the height of Japanese arrogance. I remember that the treacherous attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was not merely a military disaster, sinking part of our fleet and killing thousands of men. It was, above all, a terrible blow to American pride and belief that we had any control over the situation. That attack seemed to have opened the floodgates, and Japan, the empire of the rising sun, advanced like an unstoppable tide. From Singapore to Bataan, from Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies, it seemed there was nothing that could stop the imperial forces. They were conquering islands, colonies, and bases at a dizzying pace, capturing a quantity of resources and prisoners that rendered the generals and admirals in Washington almost impotent with rage and frustration. It was genuinely believed that Japanese power was impregnable. The morale of the American people was at rock bottom. The daily news brought only bad news, retreats, and losses. We had been dragged into a war we hadn't started, and the only thing we knew was that we were losing. This feeling of powerlessness was poison, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a shrewd leader, knew we needed more than promises of future victories. We needed a rabbit pulled from the hat, an immediate and shocking response, not only to boost our people's morale but mainly to send an unequivocal message to the enemy. This message needed to be delivered in the only place where the empire felt completely safe, its own heart. They had an almost religious conviction that their archipelago, where the emperor lived and reigned, was physically untouchable by any American force. It was a wall of water and distance that separated us. And it was precisely this wall that the next mission I would command would have to break through. The need to prove to Japan that its invulnerability was an illusion became our most urgent objective. The clamor for retaliation in the United States was deafening. President Roosevelt and the general staff could no longer ignore the public pressure and the strategic necessity of a counterattack. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, knew that we needed immediate action to relieve the pressure and, more importantly, to force Japan to reassess its defensive strategy. But how? The Navy, though it had escaped complete destruction at Pearl Harbor, was still reorganizing. Our nearest air bases were thousands of miles from Japan, far beyond the range of any available tactical bomber or fighter. Geography was our greatest enemy, and Japan shrewdly counted on it. It was in this scenario of insurmountable limitations that an idea emerged which, at first glance, seemed completely insane. The seed of this mission was planted by a Navy officer, Captain Francis Lowe. He was at the Norfolk Naval Station and observed something curious. Twin-engine Army bombers, the B-25 Mitchell, practicing landings and takeoffs on land, simulating aircraft carriers. Lowe noticed that, despite being large and heavy, the B-25 could take off from a surprisingly short runway. The spark ignited. If a B-25 could take off from aircraft carrier if we had the range to fly to Japan, we could launch a surprise attack, defying the logic of distance and Japanese invulnerability. Admiral King embraced the idea. It was radical, but it was the only viable option for a long-range attack on the heart of Japan. The plan required unprecedented cooperation between the Army, which would provide the bombers and pilots, and the Navy, which would provide transport and naval protection. I was immediately called upon. My name is James H. Doolittle, at the time a lieutenant colonel in the Army Air Force, and I was tasked with turning this crazy theory into a real combat mission. My job was to plan, adapt the aircraft, and train the men to do something that had never been done before in the history of military aviation. Launch medium-sized bombers, designed to operate from land-based airfields, from the deck of an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean. The logistical and technical complexity was immense, but the need to shock Japan and reverse American morale was even greater. We knew the impact would be more psychological than destructive, but that impact was exactly what Japan needed to feel to understand that the war was, in fact, only beginning, and that we would fight back no matter how bold or dangerous the method. The technical challenge presented to me was monumental. Taking a twin-engine medium-sized bomber, the B-25 Mitchell, and adapting it for takeoff from an aircraft carrier required modifications bordering on emergency war engineering. The first and most critical issue was weight. To reach Japan from a safe distance for the fleet, and to have enough fuel to proceed to friendly and uncertain bases in China, the B-25s needed to carry a lot, but for more fuel than its original design allowed. We had to install auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay and, crucially, in the fuselage aisle, dramatically increasing the fuel capacity to almost 1,140 gallons per aircraft. That was double what the plane normally carried. To compensate for this additional weight, I had to make difficult decisions about what to remove. All non-essential equipment was taken out. The heavy radios were discarded, meaning the crews would fly in radio silence and essentially on their own after launch. One of the most notable modifications was the removal of the tail gun turret. In its place, we installed broomsticks painted black to simulate machine guns, a simple tactic, but one we hoped could fool Japanese pilots for precious seconds in an aerial engagement. Defensive armament was reduced to a minimum, just 2 machine guns in the nose and the upper dorsal turret. All this to save every kilogram and ensure range. Alongside the aircraft modifications came the selection of the crew. The risk of this mission was obvious and extreme. We decided that the only way to find men with the necessary courage and technical skills was to ask them. Volunteers. I went to several B-25 squadrons and explained that the mission was extremely high risk, secret, and would require exceptional piloting and navigation skills. What happened was inspiring. I received an overwhelming number of positive responses. In the end, I carefully selected 80 aviators, officers, and enlisted men to pilot the 16 B-25s. Each of these men was an expert in his craft, and they all shared the same determination, to fight back. They didn't know where they were going, but they knew they were going into the most important battle of their lives up to that point. We were ready to prove to Japan that the American fighting spirit was far from being extinguished, and that distance would no longer be our excuse. It was time to take the war to them, whatever the cost. April 2nd, 1942, marked the beginning of our journey. Our 16 B-25s, stacked and tied down on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, looked like large iron birds out of their habitat. It was an unusual sight and a testament to our determination to defy military logic. We sailed from Alameda, California, in total radio silence and under the strictest secrecy. Our fleet was robust. In addition to the Hornet, we had the USS Enterprise, another aircraft carrier that would later join us as an escort and for cover, as well as cruisers and destroyers for support. We were a powerful task force. Task Force 16, sailing into the unknown, carrying the hope of a nation. The tension on board was palpable. Every kilometer traveled towards Japan increased the feeling that we were on the verge of something historic and potentially catastrophic. The original plan was to reach about 400 to 650 nautical miles off the Japanese coast and launch the bombers from there, allowing the aircraft to reach Japan, bomb their targets, and, with the extra fuel, proceed to land at unoccupied airfields in China. However, fate, as always, had other plans. On the morning of April 18th, the weather turned unstable, but it wasn't the weather that changed our course. At 7:38 a.m., we were about 650 nautical miles away, much farther than planned, when a Japanese patrol boat, the Nitto Maru, our task force, was spotted. Even though the cruiser USS Nashville sank it quickly, we knew the sentry boat had enough time to send a radio alert. The element of surprise, the crucial part of our mission, was compromised. We had to make an immediate and terrible decision. Summoned to the deck, I made the final decision. We had to take off immediately. We were 170 nautical miles further than the furthest launch point originally planned. This meant that the success of our route to China was now seriously at risk. Most of the planes would likely run out of fuel. But we couldn't risk the aircraft carrier fleet being attacked by the Japanese Air Force. I looked at the Hornet's short, rocking runway, saw the waves battering the hull and the light rain falling, and knew that takeoff would be the riskiest part of the entire mission. I gave the order. In just over an hour, the secret blade we had prepared would be launched into the heart of Japan, regardless of the risk. The fate of 80 airmen and the morale of a nation depended on that takeoff. That April 18th, 1942, is a day I will never forget. The wind on the deck of the USS Hornet was strong, but it was a crosswind, making things difficult. The rough seas caused the ship to pitch and roll, and takeoff was already incredibly risky. For a B-25 designed to take off from a long, stable runway, leaving the deck of an aircraft carrier, especially with a maximum fuel and bomb load, was an affront to aerodynamics. Each plane had only 467 feet of deck to gain speed, and the bow of the ship rose and fell violently in the waves. My aircraft, the first B-25, was at the front line. I was tense, but focused. I started the engines. The deafening noise was mixed with the roar of the wind. My orders to the other pilots were simple but vital. If you don't get out on the first try, don't try again. Deploy the landing gear and attack the water. At this altitude, the slightest mistake would mean immediate disaster, sinking a heavy aircraft in the middle of the sea. The Hornet increased its speed to maximum, and Commander Mark Mitcher, the carrier's captain, gave me the signal. I released the brakes and the B-25 began to run. The plane trembled and accelerated, but the end of the deck seemed to approach too quickly. I fought against the torque and the lateral roll. I remember feeling the nose of the plane dive as we reached the edge, and for a moment, the left engine seemed about to sink into the waves. But at the last second, I managed to pitch up and the wheels finally came off the wooden plank. The heavy machine fought against gravity, but it rose. We were in the air. I looked down and saw the deck rapidly receding, with the Hornet looking like a tiny speck in the stormy ocean. Next, I watched with my heart in my throat as the other 15 bombers followed. Each takeoff was an individual drama. Some used almost all the available space. Others nearly crashed Island from the ship. But one by one, those young and courageous pilots accomplished the impossible. At 9:20 a.m., the 16 B-25s were airborne, and the Hornet immediately turned to escape, having fulfilled its part. We were now alone, flying low over the waves, heading towards the Japanese Empire. Our mission was underway. It wasn't a major military offensive, but a daring blow to the heart, and Japan, in its illusion of security, had no idea that we were about to tell them that, from that moment on, the war would be different. After a tense takeoff, our 16 B-25s dispersed into smaller groups, flying very low. The strategy was crucial. Keep our flight at wave level, taking advantage of the Earth's curvature and the noise of the sea to avoid detection by Japanese patrol boats. Japan had a line of sentry boats and a limited but existing coastal radar network. Flying low was our only defense. We knew that, due to early sighting by Nito Maru, the Japanese would be on alert, but they were expecting a naval attack, perhaps fighter jets or dive bombers from an aircraft carrier, and not army bombers coming from such an unusual direction and flying so low. The journey across the Pacific was lonely and monotonous. We were in radio silence, relying solely on our navigation skills and the calculations we had made, knowing that any mistake would mean running out of fuel at sea. For me and the other pilots, the tension was a mixture of adrenaline and exhaustion. We had slept little and were focused on maintaining minimum altitude and saving every drop of fuel. Around noon, the moment we had trained for arrived. We began to see the coast of Japan. I was leading the first group, and what we saw was almost unbelievable. No air defenses, no large-scale Japanese air patrols. The alert given by Nito Maru, it had been interpreted by the Japanese command as a distant risk, not an imminent threat to their territory. They were unprepared, confident in their distance and the ineffectiveness of such a daring air attack. We flew directly over the islands and toward our designated targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. When we entered Tokyo airspace, the Japanese surprise was evident. People in the streets and fields looked up and waved, thinking we were friendly aircraft, perhaps some kind of training flight. The air defenses were slow to react, and when they did, it was disorganized and ineffective. I remember flying over the city at an extremely low altitude, clearly seeing the urban details and dropping our bombs. We weren't targeting civilians, but specific military targets. Factories, depots, and port areas. The objective wasn't to destroy the city, but to shatter the myth of Japanese security. The bombs fell. The material damage was secondary. What we really hit was Thepsikoff, the empire. Japan, which had acted with such impunity at Pearl Harbor, suddenly found itself under attack in its own capital. The roar of our B-25 engines over the Emperor's seat was the resounding voice of American retaliation. And it said, "You were wrong. The war is here." The impact of our bombs, though modest compared to the later area bombings of the war, resonated far beyond the explosions. In Tokyo, the shock was absolute. I remember that Japan had sold its people the idea that the war in the Pacific would be fought far from their homeland. They had assured them that the distance and the strength of their imperial navy would make the Japanese islands a safe haven, a place where life would go on unchanged. Our attack, the Doolittle Raid, dismantled that narrative in minutes. The physical damage, we hit factories, oil depots, and some shipyards, was quickly repaired. But the psychological damage was profound and permanent. Think about it. If 16 twin-engine bombers launched from aircraft carriers on a mission, kamikaze on the way there, they managed to penetrate Japanese airspace and bomb the capital itself, which would prevent a large-scale attack in the future, when the Americans had more aircraft carriers and more long-range bombers. Trauma gripped the highest echelons of the Japanese government. Emperor Hirohito and his advisors were shocked and, according to reports, deeply ashamed. The honor of the empire had been tarnished. The attack exposed a serious flaw in the defensive strategy. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which prided itself on being the shield of the empire, had failed to protect the emperor's home. This created enormous pressure on Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. He was harshly criticized for allowing such humiliation. On the American side, the effect was the opposite. The news, initially kept secret by the Pentagon, was a beacon of light in the darkness. The American people, depressed by their defeats, saw that invincible Japan could be hit. It was a spectacular moral rescue, a boost of spirits that made us believe in victory again. At that moment, the headlines no longer spoke of retreats, but of retaliation. For Japan, however, the Doolittle Raid was not a mere inconvenience. It was an omen, irrefutable proof that, contrary to what they had been told, war was truly knocking at their door. And this simple fact would fundamentally change the strategic decisions that would follow, leading Japan to a capital error. The true strategic legacy of the Doolittle Raid wasn't measured in tons of bombs dropped, but rather in the hasty and ill-considered decisions it forced the Japanese leadership to make. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the genius behind the attack on Pearl Harbor and commander of the combined fleet, felt the blow of Tokyo's humiliation more than anyone else. Japan's security was his primary responsibility, and he failed. The pressure to restore honor and, more importantly, to prevent a repeat of such an attack became his obsession. Yamamoto realized that our vulnerability lay in the distance our aircraft carriers had to travel to launch us. Hornet and the Enterprise, they had been operating dangerously close to the Japanese coast. Yamamoto's solution was drastic. He needed to expand the Japanese defensive perimeter at any cost. For him, this meant eliminating once and for all the main threat that allowed such attacks, the American aircraft carrier fleet. This urgency led him to concentrate his plans on a single decisive blow, the capture and defense of Midway Atoll, a small piece of land about 1,100 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto argued that by occupying Midway, he would create an advanced air base that would force the American fleet out of Pearl Harbor and into fighting on his terms. The intention was to lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into a crushing ambush, destroying them and ultimately bringing the United States to its knees in the Pacific. The Doolittle Raid, by proving that the Emperor's residence was not secure, gave Yamamoto the political and military leverage he needed to impose his risky and complex operation on Midway, overriding the more cautious generals of the army. Haste and overconfidence, fueled by anger over the Doolittle humiliation, led the Japanese to ignore warning signs and underestimate the American ability to decipher their codes. The Doolittle Raid was the first domino to fall. It didn't win the war, but it gave us the chance to win it. It forced Japan, in its haste to restore honor, to commit the strategic error that would become its fatal turning point less than 2 months later. The true target of our mission, therefore, was not the oil depots of Tokyo, but rather the strategic mind of Admiral Yamamoto. And we hit the bullseye. The most agonizing part of our mission began as soon as the bombs left their compartments and we started our escape route. We had to fly over 1,500 nautical miles from the Japanese coast to Allied-controlled China, flying over the East China Sea. Remember, we had to take off much further from Japan than planned. This meant that most of our planes didn't have enough fuel for the long-distance flight. The weather, which had favored us by concealing us during the approach, became our enemy in the escape. A severe weather storm hit the Chinese coast. Without radio compasses to guide our way, without airfield lights, and for many, already flying in the darkness of night with empty tanks, a safe landing was nearly impossible. I knew that most crews would face the inevitable. Of the 16 B-25s, 15 attempted forced landings or parachuted into the darkness over occupied and unoccupied China. A single B-25, under the command of Lieutenant York, was so low on fuel that it was forced to fly to the Soviet Union, where the aircraft and crew were interned and later secretly escaped. Conditions in China were terrible. Darkness, mountainous terrain, and the unknown awaited my men. In the end, 77 airmen had to parachute or make forced landings. Almost all survived the initial impact, but the ordeal was only beginning. Many of us were rescued by Chinese civilians, who risked their lives to help us escape Japanese patrols. These peasants and villagers, often unarmed, saw in us a symbol of hope, a sign that America was fighting for them. Unfortunately, not all managed to escape. 8 of my airmen were captured by Japanese forces. The Japanese, furious at the humiliation of the attack on Tokyo, treated them brutally. 2 crewmen died in captivity from illness or mistreatment. And, in an act of barbarity that shocked the world, 3 of our men, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were tried in a farcical military tribunal, found war criminals, and executed by firing squad. The rest were sentenced to life imprisonment. The outcome in China was bittersweet. Mission success, but at a terrible human cost and the capture of some of my brave men. That was the harsh reality of war. Their sacrifice, however, cemented the legacy of the Doolittle Raid, showing Japan that American retaliation would come at a high price, but with unwavering determination. The Japanese fury following the Doolittle Raid was not limited to the execution of my brave captured men. The Empire of the Rising Sun, ashamed and humiliated by the bombardment of its capital, sought revenge in a cruel and indiscriminate manner, and this revenge fell upon the people who had helped us, the Chinese civilians. As I said, most of us who survived the jump and landing were rescued by peasants in the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi. These Chinese, loyal to the Allied cause or simply willing to defy the Japanese oppressor, guided us, hid us, and fed us, risking their own lives. The Japanese, by tracking our wreckage and following our escape route, discovered this support network. The Japanese command then launched a brutal and coordinated campaign of terror, known as the Campagna Zhejiang-Jiangxi, or Operation Seigo. The stated objective was to find the remaining airmen and destroy the air bases they suspected of being involved in our escape. But the real objective was to punish the civilian population for their solidarity with the Americans, eliminating any future temptation to aid the enemy. What followed was a massacre. Japanese imperial forces entered the provinces and carried out punitive sweeps that lasted for months. Entire villages were burned, crops were destroyed to induce famine, and unspeakable atrocities were committed. The Japanese used chemical weapons in some areas and indiscriminately killed men, women, and children suspected of harboring us. The grimmest estimates indicate that the cost of this Japanese retaliation reached approximately 250,000 Chinese civilian lives. A frighteningly high number, an unimaginable price paid by those who extended a helping hand to us. This massacre reveals the true nature of the war of extermination that Japan waged in Asia. When we later learned the price the Chinese people had paid for our mission, the tactical success lost much of its luster. The Doolittle Raid accomplished its goal of shocking Japan and boosting American morale, but the hidden cost was paid in Chinese blood. This tragedy is a grim and essential reminder that, in war, the impact of military action extends far beyond the immediate battlefield. Our mission proved we could strike Japan, but the retaliation showed just how merciless the enemy could be. History shows us that great events are often the result of a series of small steps. The Doolittle Raid, though modest in its firepower, was the initial kick that set in motion the greatest turning point in the Pacific War, the Battle of Midway, which took place just 6 weeks later. As I mentioned before, the humiliation of our attack forced Admiral Yamamoto to act quickly. He was so determined to destroy the remaining American aircraft carrier fleet and extend the defensive perimeter to include Midway that he made a series of serious strategic errors. Haste and arrogance, fueled by the need to save face for the Empire, clouded his judgment. First, Yamamoto divided his forces. He devised an overly complex plan, involving a distraction in the Aleutian Islands and a massive attack on Midway. This dispersion of forces crucially diluted the strength of his aircraft carriers, which were the backbone of his power. Second, and more fatally, the need for haste caused the Japanese to neglect secrecy. They were certain that America was wounded and slow, and did not expect us to be able to decipher their naval codes. Fortunately, American intelligence, through the famous HYPO code-breaking unit, was reading much of the Japanese communication. We knew the Midway plan, we knew the when and the where. When the Japanese fleet headed for Midway, it was flying into an ambush made possible because Yamamoto, obsessed with avoiding a second Doolittle's attack, led to a decisive battle. If the Doolittle Raid hadn't forced Japan to react with such urgency, Yamamoto's plan for Midway might have been more cautious, better planned, and perhaps had a different outcome. But anger and internal pressure drove him to risk everything. At Midway, the Americans managed to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu, in a single day. These losses could not be replaced. Midway was a turning point, the turning point America needed. And it's fair to say that, if it hadn't been for the daring and improbable mission I had the honor of leading, the chessboard of war would not have been set up so favorably for our victory at Midway. Japan learned the hard way. The war was only beginning, and they had just lost the initiative. If the human cost of the Doolittle Raid was paid by the Chinese and the strategic cost was paid by Yamamoto at Midway, the psychological benefit was entirely ours. In those dark months of 1942, American morale was as crucial an asset as any fleet of ships or bomber squadron. The nation was grieving and frustrated. Our attack not only boosted fighting spirit but also restored American belief in the ability of its armed forces to fight back. The initial secrecy surrounding the origin of the attack was absolute. The War Department wanted to protect the secrecy of the aircraft carriers and prevent Japan from knowing exactly how and from where the attack had been launched. When President Roosevelt was questioned at a press conference about the origin of the bombers, he gave an evasive and brilliant answer. He said that the planes had come from a secret location, a fictitious base he called Shangri-La. The name Shangri-La was an immediate reference to the fictional, exotic, and isolated paradise of the novel Lost Horizon from James Hilton. The American public understood the joke and the need for secrecy, but embraced the idea. Shangri-La became a symbol of magical and improbable retaliation, a mysterious place from which American strength and power could emerge at any moment to strike the enemy. The story spread like wildfire, and the name Doolittle became synonymous with daring heroism. The Navy would later honor this history by naming one of its new aircraft carriers after it, the USS Shangri-La, CV-38. It was a tribute to the American ability to do the impossible and a lasting recognition of the impact of our attack on the national psyche. The mission earned me a promotion to Brigadier General and the Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration, but the most important recognition was the uplifting of the spirit of every American citizen. At that moment, the armed forces had given the American people something tangible to celebrate, proof that our cause was just and that, with courage and ingenuity, the defeat of the Japanese was only a matter of time. The Doolittle Raid ensured that the nation would have the moral will to continue the fight, an essential ingredient for winning a global war. No mission like the Doolittle Raid could have been accomplished without a workhorse capable of transforming for the task. And our winged hero was North American B-25 Michelet was a robust, reliable medium-range bomber, and crucially, with better short-runway takeoff performance than any other aircraft of its size at the time. That's what Captain Lowe saw in Norfolk, and what I needed to exploit to the fullest. The B-25, however, was never designed to fly 2,000 miles, much less take off from the deck of an aircraft carrier. Our adaptations were the key to its technical success. First came the question of fuel autonomy was our main concern. We had to add extra fuel tanks in the fuselage in the bomb bay area, and even a rubber tank that could be drained and disposed of. In total, we almost doubled the B-25's fuel capacity. This extra weight required all aircraft to be propelled to their limit on takeoff. Second, the weight and speed to achieve takeoff, we had to strip the B-25 of everything unnecessary. I've already mentioned the heavy radios and the removed tail turret. The Norden bombsight, an extremely expensive precision bombing device, was left behind. Because extreme precision wasn't the main objective, hitting Japan was. We developed an improvised, low-cost bombsight known as Doolittle's secret bombsight, essentially a rudimentary targeting system that would work for our low-altitude attacks. Third, a takeoff itself. The ultimate challenge was the maximum weight takeoff on a short runway. We worked with engineers to increase engine power and adjusted tire pressure for the steel deck. We practiced takeoff on land with marked lines to simulate the aircraft carrier. The pilots had to master the art of using maximum power and releasing the brakes with millimeter precision, relying on the air coming from the bow of the ship to gain lift at the last second. The B-25 Mitchell, converted into a long-range bomber for a one-way attack, proved to be the perfect vehicle for our impossible mission. It was a symbol of our ingenuity and determination in solving a seemingly unsolvable military problem. It allowed us to take the war to the enemy's home and prove irrefutably that Japan was not safe. The Doolittle Raid had an impact that extended far beyond the Battle of Midway. It not only accelerated the decisive confrontation but also changed how Japan viewed and conducted the Pacific War. Before our attack, Japanese strategy was based on the concept of limited warfare against the United States. They believed that by inflicting a massive and humiliating defeat at Pearl Harbor and rapidly conquering vast territories, they could force the Americans to negotiate a favorable peace agreement, allowing Japan to retain its new conquests. Our attack shattered that hope. First, he proved that the United States was not willing to negotiate under duress. Our response was immediate and aggressive. We weren't on our knees, we were standing and fighting back. Secondly, the attack demonstrated that Japan could not afford to concentrate all its naval forces on distant offensives. The need to protect national territory, including the capital and the emperor, became a priority. This forced the Japanese High Command to divert valuable resources, including fighter squadrons and patrol ships, were lost to defend the archipelago, resources that were urgently needed on the battlefronts in the South and Southwest Pacific. Japan lost the ability to concentrate all its power in a single decisive point. Third, the Doolittle Raid reinforced Americans' confidence in innovation and surprise. If we could launch long-range carrier bombers once, we could find other creative ways to hit the enemy. This mindset of tactical ingenuity would be crucial in subsequent campaigns. The enemy could no longer rely on us to do what was expected of us. In short, our attack was the first major crack in the facade of Japanese invincibility. It signaled the end of the Japanese expansion phase in the Pacific and forced Tokyo into a defensive posture, more concerned with protecting what it had than conquering what it desired. Japan, which thought it had won the war at Pearl Harbor, realized that the real fight, the total and relentless war, was only just beginning. Military history is full of daring missions, but few carry the symbolic weight and lasting strategic impact of the Doolittle Raid. For me, James H. Doolittle, and for the other 79 airmen who participated in the mission that April 18, 1942, was more than a day of combat. It was the day we proved the value of desperate courage. The legacy of the 80 does not reside solely in the bombs that fell on Tokyo or the escalation of the Battle of Midway. It resides in the demonstration that the human spirit, when confronted with overwhelming adversity, can forge a creative and daring response. The men of the Doolittle Raid, knowing their chances of survival were minimal, embarked on the mission not out of recklessness, but out of a deep conviction in the need to fight back and restore our nation's pride. Their sacrifice has never been forgotten. The men who survived Japanese captivity, enduring years of mistreatment, were rescued and became symbols of our resilience. The B-25 Mitchell became a legend, and Task Force 16, the precursor to so many other secret naval operations. Years after the war, we gathered for a solemn tradition. The Doolittle Cup became a ritual of camaraderie and remembrance. The cup bore the names of the 80 airmen. Each year, the survivors would meet, and when one of us died, their cup was turned upside down. It was a silent but powerful act of honor for those who flew the mission. It was our way of keeping alive the memory of our oath and the cost of that operation. Today, when I look back, I see the Doolittle Raid not as the end of something, but as the true beginning from the American struggle in the Pacific. It was the moment when America stopped retreating and began to advance, an advance driven by sacrifice, innovation, and audacity. We showed Japan that they could attack our ships, but they could never break our spirit. And that message, delivered at 200 knots at low altitude over Tokyo, was the blow that would seal the fate of the empire. My friends, the Doolittle Raid was never planned to be a large-scale, destructive military operation. Admiral King, President Roosevelt, and I knew that the 16 B-25s were not going to demolish the Japanese war industry. Our objective was far more subtle, but infinitely more powerful. We wanted to force Japan to confront a terrible truth. And that truth was that war would no longer be fought solely on the distant islands and jungles they had conquered. Our mission was a symbol that America was returning, stronger, more resourceful, and more determined than ever. For Japan, the explosion of each bomb over Tokyo was the formal announcement that the era of easy victories was over, and that the war was, in fact, only just beginning. They were forced to stretch their resources, divert their elite units, and, in the heat of humiliation, rush to Midway, where they met a defeat that changed the course of history. That is the legacy of the B-25s, of the impossible takeoff, and of the courage of the 80. If you felt inspired by this story of audacity and revenge in the Pacific, remember, the history of aviation in World War II is a vast field full of heroes. Call to action. If you enjoyed this video and value the research and storytelling work we do here at WW2 Pilots, please leave your like. Your like helps us bring these stories to more people. And if you haven't already, click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our in-depth analyses of aviation and the battles of World War II. Invitation to the next video. And for our next dive into history, we're going to explore an American mission almost as daring as the Doolittle Raid, but one that few people know about. We'll be investigating the story of the pilots who had to adapt to fly and land their B-25s and C-47s, not on aircraft carriers, but in unimaginable conditions. The construction and operation of makeshift airstrips on farms and ranches in Texas, used to secretly train aviators before they were sent to the front. Stay tuned for the next video, where the war zone is the barn and the runway is the pasture.